These webinars are recorded, and I just started the recorder now. All right, we're going to go back one slide to make sure that the entry slide is on that recording before we get fully started. So again, remember to mute your phones, remember to unmute. When you want to talk, to ask a question, you can use the chat feature or you can raise your hand. You have that option on your right. CAPE staffers have been invited to be online, and they will interject if they have some updates for us. And last of all, as I stated, the webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the CAPE website, usually within 24 to 48 hours after the webinar concludes. So feel free to log into that and share with your colleagues or update your own knowledge when you have the question of surveys before you. Today, our goal, of course, is to problematize the quality of the surveys. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to contextualize them as you put a survey in as evidence in your self-study. So we'll be talking about the particular pros and cons of surveys and survey data, through CAPE's perspective at least, and develop some responses to the evidence quality questions that are related to surveys. We'll be looking a good bit at the assessment rubric when we do that work, and I have a copy open here that I'll share with all of you. If you do have a copy of the CAPE assessment rubric, you might want to have that available for yourself. And then we're going to apply those criteria for evidence review, and we'll be using the rubric for that, to a sample survey or two or three, and get a feel for what makes for a quality survey and how one might apply some of these criteria to your own surveys and your presentation of surveys in your self-study. So I hope this is helpful, and again, I encourage you to raise questions at any point during the webinar, but I have embedded some feedback and question pauses throughout. Okay, so I thought we'd start with where are surveys expected, and this is where CAPE has called out surveys as a sample, as an example of the kind of evidence that could be presented. And the first area, and when I say AH, page 90, I mean the accreditation handbook on page 90 or page 95. You can submit a survey 1.1 on component 1.1 in standard 1 if it's related to candidate content knowledge and pedagogical content knowledge if it's administered by the state. As you know, any state required surveys or data must be submitted as part of your self-study, and so that's been included in standard 1.1 if your state has a required survey that is directly related to content knowledge or candidates' preparation content pedagogical knowledge. Okay. You can employ a survey related to the quality of clinical educators, and this was in the accreditation handbook on page 95. I'll show you the accreditation handbook here for a moment. Okay, I'm on page 79 right here. And as you can see, it says any related state surveys right there under 1.1. So that's why I called that out. Let's go to page 95 and see where CAPE has mentioned that surveys can be used. There we go. Okay, right here, surveys of, and I'm highlighting that section, of clinical educators, candidates, employers, and or human services directors. And this is related to the component 2.2 that talks about clinical educators, okay, and the qualifications of those clinical educators. So there we are. You can use a survey if it's related to teaching effectiveness, and this is particularly if you're using student surveys of the kind that CAPE has referred to as the tripod survey, okay, or the work of Ron Ferguson, same thing. Cambridge Education are the ones who have that survey available to people, all right? So those two can be used in 4.2. In 4.2, all right, here, as effectiveness, okay? And it says, including comparing trends over time and benchmarking, etc. And right here is where it recommends, or not recommends, but that it suggests that a survey of students can also be used. And then, of course, in 4.3 and 4.4, both of those are the surveys that we're most familiar with in EPPs, which are our employer satisfaction surveys and our completer surveys. And we have some examples of employer surveys to look at in just a moment as we continue through when surveys are expected and how they'll be evaluated by CAPE. Any feedback or any questions at this point before we continue about where surveys are recommended by CAPE or suggested by CAPE? Checking now to see if anyone's hand is up. Don't see any raised hands at the moment. And I don't see any questions in my chat box. Again, if you were late arriving, if you do have a question for me, please direct it to me as the host. I've been missing questions in the past, and I believe it's because people have been sending it, not realizing who they've selected to send those questions to. Okay, so we know for at least at a basic level, CAPE is expecting surveys, certainly for the candidate and employer satisfaction in Standard 4. And I think those are surveys that most of us have developed through the years. That was something that would not have come as a surprise in accreditation at any point earlier. So what are the pros and cons of surveys from a CAPE perspective at this point? Well, the pros are that they certainly gather information for continuous improvement, and they do access that broad spectrum of stakeholders. Using surveys for your cooperating teachers, for your candidates, for your employers, etc., gives you that additional outsider perspective as well as insider perspective on the preparation of your candidates and your programs. Some of the cons, however, and these are things that CAPE is concerned about for the survey development, is in the poor design of surveys, that there's sort of unclear accuracy in responses, and we'll get in a moment to some of the criteria for evaluation. So that say, keep it to a simple and single response, because we don't know, if you look at the question sometimes, what it is that respondents have responded to. Was able to design instruction and deliver appropriate lessons? Which part of that STEM was being responded to in the answers? The other concern that CAPE has is that there's no independent comparison of the results. They sort of stand alone. And what CAPE would like to see, of course, is cross-comparison with other measures, with other stakeholders, and with other assessments that you use of candidates, so that there is some use of those multiple measures to inform each other and attempt to triangulate your data and tell you how the surveys respondents, how that fits into your total picture about candidate performance. And then, of course, there's the reliability and validity issues in surveys, and that's something that we'll discuss in greater depth when we do the webinar on reliability and validity. But I will show you on the rubric, on the CAPE rubric, where you should be paying some close attention when it comes to evaluating your own surveys before submission. So another concern of CAPES is about handling conflicting reports. So what if your candidate survey results are that everybody was thrilled with their preparation program and felt extremely well prepared, and yet if you look at the surveys from employers, let's say, or from cooperating teachers, they're not so positive in their responses. So how are you dealing with those conflicting reports? It is not unusual for something like that to happen, as candidates, at least within preparation programs, tend to be a little more optimistic about their eventual effectiveness and about their preparation. So it's not unusual. The question then for CAPE is, okay, given the fact that there's some diversity in the responses from various stakeholders, how are you handling that? How are you looking at that? And then finally, a lack of a systematic collection. I think this is something that has perhaps been true in the past. I think perhaps less so. But if this is true at your institution, there should be some plan in place for when and how often and under what conditions you're going to be administering surveys. We can get ourselves to a point where we're surveying people too much, so that there's a survey overload or data fatigue or survey fatigue that can happen, and it'll drop your response rate. So you have to think systematically about that collection of data and try to both balance it in a way that you know that folks aren't getting too tired in their receiving surveys and being expected to respond to surveys. So systematic collection is another point to consider. So here's where we're going to look at the assessment rubric, and that's what I mean when I refer to AR and Category 1. That's the assessment rubric, Category 1, as well as the evidence guide on page 25. So let's take a look at both those instruments right now. First, the final rubric. Here we are with the CAPE rubric, assessment rubric. I've got it open to the survey section here. We'll refer to that in a minute. I want to go back to the very first categories right here. Category 1 is about your instrument purpose and use. And so as you're writing your self-study and you know you're going to be submitting survey results and your survey to CAPE as part of your evidence collection, then you'll want to look at this rubric right here and talk about framing the context in your self-study using the rubric as a reference point. Because what they're going to be asking about your instrument purpose and use is that exactly what I share here. When is it administered? How do you use the results? Is it purposeful and consequential? Is there standards alignment that is explicit? Okay, so going back to that final rubric, those are the points that you see here. If you want to be at the target level to meet the minimum criteria of CAPE, you need to be at level 3 here. That the pointer points when the survey is administered are explicit, that the purpose and use, okay, for candidate monitoring on decisions and progressions is specified, and that the standards informing the survey are explicit, okay? So that will be one of the context questions that would come up about your survey during their self-study. The second is about survey development, and let's take a look here. In broad terms, it talks about, does it describe there are stages of piloting and refinement? Is the instrument integrated with curriculum and those stages of progression? And were stakeholders engaged at multiple stages? This time, I'm going to open up the evidence guide on page 25, okay? And here you've got the section that begins on page 25 about how the surveys were constructed. And although the rubric for evaluation is going to be asking, let's go back here, it's going to be asking about the stages of piloting, whether it's integrated with the curriculum, how stakeholders have been involved. These kinds of questions that you see in the evidence guide might be useful to you as you're developing your documentation related to survey submission. For example, it says, is it clear how the EPP develops a survey, who developed the survey, evidence that prior research was used, and that the survey was pilot tested. So these are aspects of the context that you could develop when submitting a survey that would be very, very useful. And last category that we're going to talk about here as being upfront in terms of context when you submit your self-study about surveys is informing those respondents to the survey. Was the purpose described to them? Was the use of the results explained? Were the instructions included about what to do? And was the basis for good enough explicit? We'll be looking at a couple of surveys in a few minutes, and we'll come back to this part about informing respondents up front. If we go back to our evidence guide, informing respondents is this final category 5 that it begins on page 26 and continues on 27. And what the evidence guide tells us a little bit more about a survey is that a cover letter or preamble should be there in the survey to explain what respondents are being asked to do and why they're being asked to do that. And then it has some additional items about the structure of the survey itself, and about it being logical, etc. So again, I suggest that referring both to the evidence guide as well as the assessment rubric can be very, very helpful to your development of a survey and your submission of the survey to CAPE as a piece of evidence. Okay. Let me pause it again at this point. We're only about 18, 20 minutes into this, and ask if there are any questions. I'm looking for raised hands, and I don't see any right now. And don't see any questions in the chat box. Remember to direct them to me as the host. I'd appreciate it. Okay. All right, I'm going to continue then. Now here, I think this is particularly important in your development of surveys and your own evaluation of the quality of your survey. Because the CAPE assessment rubric then, jumping down to category 8, is explicitly about surveys themselves. And it asks these questions. Are there simple direct questions sorted by categories? Is there a single subject and not 2 or more attributes? If there are 2 or more attributes, then this gets back to what was noted earlier as a potential con of surveys, is you're not sure what the respondents are directing their responses to if there are more than 1 attribute. Are the items stated in terms of behaviors? Is the scoring anchored in performance? Are leading questions avoided? And do all questions have a parallel category, parallel structure? So let me get back to the evidence guide and show you where in the evidence guide you can find these items. On page 26, right under that second category about how surveys are developed, you will see a list of the questions right here. Are individual items or questions constructed in a manner that is consistent with sound research practice? Okay, and so here you see those questions listed right here. And it could be an independent activity to perhaps, give a checklist or the rubric for evaluation to a couple of faculty members along with the survey that you have, and ask them to rate their own surveys and see if these kinds of things are meet the criteria, CAPE's criteria or not. Okay, so again, these questions about the types of questions and the quality of those questions appear on the evidence guide on page 26, and they also appear on that final rubric for assessment. And now we're going to drag this down to category 8, which I think belongs right there. We go, which talks about scoring levels, if those levels are clearly distinguishable. And there's an interesting note here on the category side. It tells you, too, that these aspects of the rating scales, the scoring levels, that they inform reliability and also about actionability, okay? And so these are some of the criteria for quality evidence that your reviewers, both the assessment reviewers, if you submit a survey for early evaluation, or for your site visitors, these will be the rubrics that they'll use to evaluate your evidence. So let's look here at this, whether there are vague general terms used to differentiate levels or whether those key attributes are included, that the levels represent a developmental progression, etc. And you can look at this more at your leisure a little later, okay? When it comes to screening scores, this isn't particularly applicable to a survey, okay? But that criteria is in here, okay? There we go. Okay. So what we're going to do now is take a look at an actual survey. I'm going to take you to an employer survey that I call survey number 3. And we'll keep referring back to these questions that I've raised on the criteria for evaluation. So here it is. Let me bring it up a bit larger and give you a few minutes to take a peek at this. We're going to get even bigger. Go to 150. There we are. Much better. Okay. The basic STEM is, how satisfied are you with XYZ graduates? Okay. And we have the following STEMs: knowledge of content and structure of the discipline, ability to teach challenging context, skills in assessing student learning, etc. And let me give you a few minutes to look this over. All right. It would appear that this particular list was generated from some of the outcomes that were expected by the institution, and probably aspects that were included on a student teaching observation form, something like that. However, without the context, the preamble, to tell us about this, we wouldn't necessarily know that. And that would be some of the information you'd want to include as you're submitting it and writing your self-study. So let's look at number 1. Are these simple and direct questions sorted by categories? No. We'd have to say some are simple and direct, but these particular ones in here are not really sorted into any kind of category that might help the respondent, in this case an employer, focus their attention on, content knowledge first, or ability to diversify instruction, okay? And maybe there might be a few items under that, instructional planning, etc. And so it's just a whole set here. We'd have to say to ourselves, maybe it might be useful to have at least put subheadings in here to keep people like items grouped together and have people be focused on those particular aspects of candidate performance before moving on to another. Because the very next section just jumps into how would you rate your overall satisfaction with the graduates. Okay, the next one was their single subject and not 2 or more attributes. Well, I think in most cases there were single subject. and not 2 or more attributes, and yet I direct you to look at item F, which states, how satisfied are you with the graduate's ability to communicate learning expectations, directions for activities, explanations of content, as well as modeling of correct oral and written language? And I would think, as an employer, I might say, well, you know, gosh, they're really not. That particular candidate that I hired isn't really good about communicating learning expectations, aside from writing a name on the board at the beginning of instruction. And that's an area I would want that person to be better at, but they're pretty good at explaining content. Okay, so this one, when you get a response of very satisfied or dissatisfied, let's say you're not really sure about which aspect of this are they responding to. Now, I did get a question, thank you so much, in the CAPE chat box that says, does CAPE recommend excluding the uncertain or neutral option in their rating scale? And I would say no, CAPE doesn't recommend excluding that. As far as I know, I've never heard anybody say to exclude that. And it actually might be very important to have that, or simply not observed is another possibility in that category. I'm not really certain, or I haven't observed that, or it's not applicable, to this particular situation. So yes, I think it would be very useful, as opposed to simply having, a non-answer, a skipped answer, or an answer that really doesn't have meaning. So good question, and I hope my response was appropriate. So let's go back to the other thing. So we've just determined, I think, that there are some items in this particular survey that have 2 or more attributes, and that's where it gets a little confusing about what the respondents are referring to. Okay, are all these items stated in terms of behaviors? Let's go back to the survey. Are they stated in terms of behaviors? Anybody like to give me their preliminary feeling about that? We can get a little group interaction in here. Anybody brave enough to speak up? I can unmute you all. I'm hearing some folks.
I'm sorry.
I'm going, hi. No, that's fine. Okay, well, I guess nobody's going to speak up. At least I can't hear anybody speaking up, so I'll take a stab at this. I'm noticing that there are a lot of these abilities, stems here, the ability to teach challenging content to their student, as opposed to teaches challenging content to their students. An ability to create a learning environment, whereas creates a learning environment of respect and rapport. Ability to engage students in learning activities as opposed to engages students in their learning activities. So my initial reaction to this would be that I think that there are ways in which these particular items might be more strongly worded as observable behaviors as opposed to abilities. Because it seems to me that we could have, candidates can definitely not necessarily demonstrate an ability, or to demonstrate an ability poorly or whatever. Anyway, in any case, I think that it might be more positive to state it in more explicitly by teaches, does, talks, communicates, blah, blah. Okay. Is the scoring anchored in performance? Is the scoring anchored in performance? Well, in this case, the scoring is not anchored in performance, but in satisfaction, and in being satisfied with what they observe, as opposed to rating their performance. And let's see the next one. Are leading questions avoided, and do all questions have a parallel structure? I think we can look at those two together. And I think that leading questions are avoided here because it's asking about satisfaction. Okay, and seems to me so let's go to the rest of the survey and see how it goes. How would you rate your overall satisfaction with graduates? Okay, that's it. And in the beginning, here's what we see. The following two sets of questions, what they're based upon, and it asks in the first set of questions to relate the importance to a teacher's ability, skills, or dispositions. And in the second, hear feedback about graduate performance. So let's move over to those questions we had earlier. It would be asked about informing respondents. Is the purpose described? Is the use of the results explained? Are instructions included about what to do? And is the basis for good enough explicit? So I think with this particular survey, the instructions are included about what to do, and it's an interesting approach they've taken. And then, but the use of the results has not been explained, nor has the purpose been described for this particular survey. All right. I want to look at two new surveys here. The first will be an employer survey for April to give you a basis for comparison, right? And remember, if you have a question for me, you can put it in the chat box or you can raise your hand. And what I want to do is drag this over. There we go, and fill my screen with it. Good. There we go. So let's start with this survey. We've got a survey for principals, supervisors of graduates of their teacher education program, and they ask for some general information about the person's position, about how many graduates have been hired, about how many are currently teaching in the school, and what subjects or grades they're teaching. In part two, it says rate the preparation of all these graduates who you've hired over the last 5 years and of whom you are knowledgeable, and tell us how many you're considering in your rating. Okay, so maybe you're just thinking about 2 graduates, maybe you're thinking about 20 graduates, and they've asked for that information up front. But then we go into a whole series of items about the graduates of this particular program. And it says, in arriving at your rating, keep in mind a novice teacher should be expected to possess. Okay, what they're trying to deal with here, I think, is that beginning teachers not be compared with the most experienced teachers in a building. So they're reminding the respondents, the principals, the supervisors, to talk about beginning teachers here. Keep beginning teachers in mind as you rate our students. Okay? So here we go. Do they understand this? Do they teach these concepts in a way? Do they understand how different students are learning? Do they help all students achieve? Okay? And their categories are extremely well prepared, not adequately prepared, or very poorly prepared. So you see that this particular employer survey is one that approaches the task of gaining feedback differently from the survey we just looked at. Okay? What I would, and notice that as it continues, they also repeat at the top of each page that this should refer to novice or beginning teachers. Okay, and I don't see any items here that talk about abilities but rather seem to be framed in ways that are more observable. Maintain, use, plan, evaluate. Okay. And then, as before with the other survey, it says overall, how do you feel our graduates are prepared to begin their first years of teaching as novice teachers, and underscoring that part. And then finally, there's a final section that asks for suggestions and thanks the respondents for completing the questionnaire. Okay, so let's go back here to the items that we had for evaluation. Were there simple, direct questions sorted by categories? Again, I don't think we have that here. No, we've got 22 items, again, that are not necessarily sorted into categories. Okay, so it will be up to your reviewers here to determine if they feel that's a drawback. And there is some certainly subjective judgment involved in that. Single subject and not two or more attributes. I think we did see most of them were single subject. Okay, I'm going to scroll down here and keep this part open. Okay. Right. Are items stated in terms of behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in comparison, we look at employer survey number 3 as opposed to the other employer survey, that there are some similarities in the sense that the STEM seem to have been based or drawn from probably program proficiencies, none of which were categorized, okay, as Kate might have hoped, okay, which is not in itself a deal breaker, and yet something to consider. Would it help your respondents to gather their thoughts if certain items were listed under categories? Okay, I'm going to go back up here to our respondents question. And was the purpose described in this second survey? Were the use of the results explained? Were there instructions about what to do? And was the basis for good enough explicit? So let's look at this. Was the purpose described? Not seeing that. But perhaps there was a cover letter that accompanied this survey, or a preamble that went before it that wasn't included in the submission. And that's something to keep in mind when you're submitting evidence for your self-study. Are you including all the pieces that would be important for the reviewers to see or to know about in order to adequately evaluate your submission? Okay? So perhaps along with the survey and then the results of the survey, submitting that cover letter or preamble or introduction that goes with the survey when it's sent out would be really, really important to include. And if you don't include it, definitely take the time when you're given the opportunity to explain the context of your submissions that you describe these pieces explicitly. Good. All right, I'm going to share one other survey with you, and that is this one here. There we go. Let me drag it down again and enlarge it. And what we see here, this is third and final, it says it's the MAT Preparation Program Employer Survey. So you know exactly who it's for, and it tells you right at the beginning that it's conducting a study for preparing earth science teachers in this particular case. And the critical component is the collection of information from employers. Okay, so it explains what it's asking for It tells you that the survey is voluntary and who it's being sent to. And that if you're not familiar, please, pass the survey on to someone who else is. It talks about the confidentiality here, and that, don't provide any details that would make it possible to identify you, your graduate, or yourself, your school, and thanks you for taking the time to complete the survey. It also says that once you finish it, you're going to be given contact information and that you will receive a 1-year family membership to blank. And it tells you that the information that you provide, how it's going to be valuable to the study itself and to the institution, the preparation program. They just block that piece out. So notice what they've done here on this one. It's got the directions right at the top of the page, and it has categories. Okay, I think these are the same items that you would see on another survey, certainly. Okay. Do they know and understand major concepts and principles of the science being taught? It's explicit about science because we learned that this survey is expressly for earth science teachers. And so it directs people to think about, okay, first we're going to talk about science content knowledge. Next, we're going to talk about student needs. Next, we're going to talk about instructional planning. So those categories of responses are at the forefront here. And I think that intention here is to help the respondents organize their thinking. Okay, wait a minute, instead of shifting gears, wait a minute, do they address student needs? Do they effectively plan? This is intended to keep people focused and to have their responses directed in particular areas of concern to the EPP and their preparation. Okay, so let's go down to the final. We've got instructional strategies and the last school and community relations. Notice these are still 22 items to respond to. I think the other 2 surveys that we shared had around the same number of items. But I also feel like categorizing them into areas like this sort of helps it to feel, instead of this big long list, helps to break it up a bit and make it a little more manageable in the mind of others. Whoops, wait, there are 25 items. And then the final thing evaluates their overall satisfaction. Okay, it does note that there, in this particular survey, that there are additional text box questions. And it says, given your experience, what are the strengths of our programs? What do you recommend would strengthen our program? And then reminds respondents that when they're done, they should give contact information to get that 1-year family membership to wherever. Okay? So I think that is an important part here, where it's telling people up front that this is going to happen, and then it reminds them at the end and gives them a pretty critical piece of information that when they click the done button, they're going to go to a separate page. Okay, so it's been pretty clear about what they should expect at the conclusion of the survey. So with this particular survey, I think it has some solid strengths in that the introductory letter is included up front, and that it gives all the information that CAPE would be looking for in terms of informing respondents. It describes what the purpose is. It tells them how the results are going to be used. It's got instructions about what to do. I think the one thing that it doesn't note is this basis for good enough. What is good enough? And I wonder how one might include that in a survey. Perhaps saying that, our hope is that you would be satisfied with the results with the preparation of our candidates, that most of our candidates would have been adequately prepared in your estimation. However, we are interested in understanding of what areas they may need, our preparation program may need to be strengthened. So that might be a way to address that. Okay, this section here on instrument development is something that would not be included in the survey itself and should not be something that you are concerned about in the survey instrument itself. But let's go on to those criteria for evaluation one last time. And what it says is, I think that we've gone over these questions enough at this point, where those are simple, direct questions. Most of them were single subject and stated in behavioral terms. Okay, let's go back to that survey one more time and take a look at that and see if we find any questions that seem to have more than one. Well, here's one. Strive to understand and be responsive to family and community needs. In situations like this, where you have two stems and you say, oh, these are really, really important, what you might want to do here is say, okay, of the two, which is the most important to your program? And perhaps instead of striving to understand, the more important part is responsive to family and community needs. Okay? You can, look at your stems from that perspective. Okay? And anything else here? Displays effective verbal, nonverbal, and media communication skills. Creates enthusiasm and motivation for science. I mean, we can pick these apart and say, oh, wow, enthusiasm versus motivation are two different things, and get into a fine-tuned discussion about that. So your choices are these. Go ahead and leave it as it is, because that's important for your thinking that enthusiasm and motivation should be together in a single item. Default to the one that you feel is the most important. Create enthusiasm for science, or develop motivation to continue science learning, whatever it may be. And let me see, anything else here that I wanted to point out? Okay, perhaps we could quibble with know and address student misconceptions. If they can identify what student misconceptions are and then can address those, it might be two separate stems. Okay. I'm going to go now on to the next few slides, and I think my next one is a feedback and question pause. And it is. So let me view attendees to see if anyone has their hand up. I don't see any raised hands. Okay. And in my questions, I don't see anything in the chat. Again, if you were late in arriving, please, if you have a question, direct it to me as the host in order for me to be assured of seeing your question. Okay, anybody want to speak up? Okay, and let's see if I have anything else to share with you. Yes, the dispositional surveys. This appears on the assessment rubric under Category 8, and let me get to that and show you where it appears. Category 8. There we go. Dispositional surveys. Information for respondents right here. Okay. What Kate is asking about here is if dispositional surveys are going to be included in your self-study, they want more of an explanation from EPPs about how those dispositions are related to effective teaching and the impact on P12 learning. So they want to see that judgments about dispositions are anchored in actual performance, and that those performances are related to teaching practice. And so what you would want to do is to talk about your survey development and your use of the results in terms of how it's related to effective teaching and impact on P12 learning. explicitly. And I don't think that has always been done necessarily in the past when people submitted dispositional survey data. They would say, well, these are the dispositions that we've identified as key to our program and our mission, our conceptual framework, and these are the results of our ratings of candidate dispositions, whether those were self-ratings or let's say clinical supervisor ratings about dispositions observed during student teaching. And yet the talk about how those dispositions are framed in terms of impact on student learning or in terms of effective teaching have not always been present. And so CAPE is looking for that additional information now if dispositional surveys are used. Okay, this is it, folks. It is 1:52. Whoops, just slipped to 1:53. We have about 7 minutes left in our webinar here, and I am available for questions, comments, feedback. I'm checking and still don't see any hands raised. And I don't see any other questions in my chat room. Let me tell you about next steps, and then I'm going to hang out for at least 5 minutes here, and hope questions will come my way. Otherwise, this is the final slide in the webinar presentation, and I encourage you to fill out a 6-question feedback survey that will be emailed to you within 48 hours. If you registered for the conference, for the webinar, then you will receive a survey that asks for some feedback about the webinar. This record will be posted on the CAPE website within 48 hours. If you go to the CAPE website, click on the Resources tab, and it should appear there along with the other webinars that have been presented up to this point. Our next 3 webinars are listed below. One is on Tuesday, May 26th. It's going to focus on case study. There's one on June 4th, which will focus on portfolios. And what we've been doing in the beginning here is to present each of the kinds of evidence that are typical or usually submitted to CAPE as for accreditation as part of a self-study, whether it's a survey or a scoring rubric, observational rubrics, portfolios, case studies, in the case that CAPE has recommended case studies in a couple of examples, and we'll get into those in greater depth. And so we chose, after giving an overview of the accreditation handbook and the evidence guide, to start focusing on these individual evidence items and talk about quality, since quality of evidence is a concern of CAPE. Then we'll begin to go into the self-study, and we'll talk next at in mid-June about drafting plans as part of the self-study. And if you have your self-study due either in 2016 or 2017, then you know that submitting plans is acceptable to CAPE if you don't have data up to that point or available. And so we'll talk a bit about what a good plan should look like, what you should include in your plans, and some more details about CAPE's expectations. So that's what we have ahead of us. And that's it for me today, folks. We've got another 5 minutes here. And, oh yes, yay, I got another question in the chat. Can you get copies of the PowerPoint? Yes, you can. I actually emailed one to someone today. CAPE is not posting those PowerPoints. However, I will ask if they will include posting the PowerPoint in addition to the recording so that you have the PowerPoint that goes with the recordings, okay? And so I will definitely consider that. But if that doesn't happen, feel free to email me. My email was on the very first slide. And let me go all the way back to that. It's fairly straightforward. It's deb.mylastname@gmail.com, and I will send it out to you personally. Okay, I've got some, great. So if you have a meeting soon, just email me. There's my email address. I'll send it to you in the next 5 minutes once the webinar's over. Okay, why doesn't CAPE provide employer completer surveys that are approved to be used and have been tested for reliability and validity, at least at the EPP level? Programs can amend as needed. That is a terrific question, and the issue has been that at this point, CAPE has not developed those, hasn't received those. Remember, we're still in the period where EPPs are submitting instruments for evaluation like right now. The first deadline for that is October 1st. Some of the early adopters have submitted some surveys and other things, but those have not yet been evaluated. The evaluators are being trained this month, in fact, to provide feedback on those instruments. And so right now, CAPE doesn't have those available. So what it will be doing in the future, and it is CAPE's intention to do this, is to provide examples of instruments that have been used and that have received high ratings and that do have reliability and validity in them. There is a foundation, the Bush Foundation, that has an employer survey developed, and that they are encouraging EPPs to consider using. I have a draft of that instrument, but you would have to get in touch with the Bush Foundation independently and ask about that, because I don't know what's involved. I don't know if it's free of charge, if they charge for that. I don't know. But I could share that instrument with you. If you'd like to shoot me a quick email that says you'd like to see it, I will share that. You can also get it by writing to Jennifer, who is a member of the CAPE staff, Jennifer Currency. She will be happy to share that as well. So there are two ways to get at that, at an employer completer survey that has been tested for reliability and validity. I believe there are a couple of states that have also developed instruments. Tennessee may be one of them that has employer surveys and completer surveys that they send out at the state level. And I would have to do, and you could as well, some kind of a Google search to see if you could get the actual instrument. What I have seen are the results, okay, but not the instrument itself. And since it's proprietary, I don't know to what extent some of the states are willing to share those surveys. So to find an answer to that question, you could contact Elizabeth as CAPE staff, who's in charge of state relations. And Elizabeth would be the person who could send you in the right direction and put you in touch with a couple of states, or perhaps even query the states herself and ask if anyone is willing to share instruments that have been developed at the state level that have reliability and validity. Okay? And I thank you for your question, because I will share those questions and those comments with CAPE. Okay, great. So for right now, all I have, those are all the questions I have in chat. And I see somebody's hand up. I'm so happy. Sue, I see your hand up, and I'm going to be quiet now. Please ask your question. Sue, let me get you off mute. Nope. Okay. There you are. You're off mute. Sue, you want to speak up? Okay. For some reason we can't hear you, Sue. I see you are not muted on your own phone, and you're not muted. There you are.
Oh, you can hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Yay,
So
okay. Okay, I'm in Ohio, and we do have surveys that the state sends out to our resident educators, to the employers, as well as to the student teachers, and we have no control over what they do, you know, or how they have formed their surveys. So that's not going to be a problem for us, is it, if we use those?
No, it's not going to be a problem for you if you use those. What I would do is to write to Rebecca Watts. Isn't she in your state?
Yes.
Yes. Write to Rebecca.
Okay.
And she knows that you're going to need as much information as you can possibly get on the reliability and the validity, et cetera. And you know you're not alone in this, too.
Okay.
In Ohio. Everybody else needs it, too. So I may get in trouble with Rebecca for this, but definitely shoot her an email and say, listen, Kate,
yeah,
requires that we, that we submit this information, and can you give us something that we can all use?
Okay, all right. Well, that's good information, because I would not have thought to do that. So yeah, I'll contact Rebecca. She hears from me a lot. Also,
you can tell her I sent you, so that you don't get in trouble.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Go ahead. You had another question.
I know another problem that Rebecca and I have communicated about is the difficulty that we get sometimes having employers actually respond to the survey. They send out the surveys, but if they don't respond, there's not a whole lot we can do about it, and I'm not sure why the principals are so hesitant to do the survey, except I know they're busy. And I don't know if the state of Ohio has any plans to, hand out family plans to join FitWorks or something. I don't know, but I thought that was a great idea from MAT. Give them something. But yeah,
even if
they don't know what else to do.
A museum entrance or something.
Yeah, there you go.
It's appreciated.
Right, but there's really nothing to incentivize them to do the survey. So, how do we handle that?
Okay, when you submit that in your self-study, one of the things that you should consider including in your statements is, especially in your analysis, you put it into context, and you say, these surveys were sent out to, 150 employers, 10 responded, okay?
If we're lucky.
And so, yes, exactly, and of those 10 that responded, no 3 of them represented the same grade level or subject area, and so, we can really draw limited conclusions from this.
Okay.
One of the things that CAPE will ask is, so what are your intentions or plans for improving the response rate? Okay. And I think this is where, if you are in conversation with Rebecca or others in Ohio about how to increase response rates, you can simply say that, their conversations are underway with the state about how we might incentivize responding to increase response rates. I know there's some stuff online about the way that response rates have been increased.
Okay.
With surveys, and doing some kind of a brief lit review might be helpful.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's a good idea. All right. Great. Great. Could I ask you one other question that's related back to the assessments?
Yes, please do, and then I have a question in the chat that I'll get to next.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. I'm wondering for the submissions on instrument purpose, development, responded information, et cetera, those would be for key assessments that we use, right, like our capstone assessments that we do. Okay. And would that be I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, yes, your capstone, but also your unit-wide assessments. And I consider surveys of employers and candidates to be a unit-wide assessment. So it would apply.
Okay. Okay. All right. Because, you know, for our capstones in our courses, we don't have multiple scorers for those. You know, it would just be the professor of that course. I think if we asked everybody to rate each other's capstones as well as their own, there might be a little rebellion. So is that expected, though, for capstones to have multiple scorers all the time? Or?
Boy, that's a really good question, and I'm hesitating as I think that through.
I mean, it's a great idea, but it's not real practical.
Right. I think you're going to have to, you know, maybe. I mean, how many different raters do you have of capstones? I mean, how many people supervise capstones?
Well, it would be all of our full-time faculty, because we have a capstone for every course. So it would be, we have 10 full-time faculty, and we have a number of adjunct faculty as well who would be teaching.
Okay, so at least for the adjunct faculty and for your, at least for your adjunct faculty and probably for your full-time faculty, you should think about perhaps having a training.
Okay.
Or a couple of trainings and go at it from that direction. You know, that, you know, here's the rubric, here's the ways that, you know, here are the features that we look for, you know, give out a couple of, you know, samples and have people rate them all together and see sort of what kind of difference there is, try to come to some sort of inter-rater agreement there, you know, see if everybody's within reason in terms of rating the capstone project, and then talk through the differences, and that may be how to deal with it.
Okay.
Since you don't have multiple raters, okay?
Okay, sounds like a good idea. All right, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay. You're very welcome. All right, here's a question on the chat, and I'm going to move on to that because we're already 9 minutes over. Can field experience evaluations be conducted by survey, or do they have to be rubrics with text instead of rating scales? Oh boy. Haha. Field experience evaluations. Oh, I think I'd want to know what we mean by field experiences here. If we're talking about student teaching, I'd say absolutely no. If it's got to be somehow observed, okay, and that those observations have to have some way to provide feedback to candidates on how they're doing. That's why the rubric issue is a good one as opposed to just a checklist and a scale. All right, it's because you really want to be able to use those rubrics to provide candidates with feedback on their performance and to talk about, well, you seem to be at the emergent level here, and in order to get to proficient, as you can see in the rubric, these are the kinds of things I need to be able to see you doing, okay? So the field experiences, if those are pre-student teaching field experiences, and they have, for example, a case study of an English language learner is perhaps a field experience and product that is a fairly typical kind of exercise for candidates. It's just their first time out in the field. Get them in a classroom, get them with a particular student, you know, get them with a student who may be struggling reader or, you know, a language learner. Could those evaluations, well, those evaluations are largely done, those aren't really observational, they're largely done, you know, as a result of the product that's submitted by the student. It is the actual case study of that student or learner. You could do a survey if what you were doing is surveying the teachers in whose classrooms these students were. That makes sense? And you could do a survey of the candidates to say, you know, how useful was this particular activity, what challenges did you encounter, you know, that kind of stuff. So I can think of ways that surveys could be used, but the end result of that would be more program improvement than they would be candidate performance evaluation. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Let's see. Anybody else with a question? Sue's hand is still up, but I know that was from before. And I think we're all good here. So, folks, we're already almost 2:15. I thank you to those who have hung out with us until the bitter end. I look forward to seeing you all at a future webinar, and I will be sending out the webinar survey within 24 to 48 hours. And if there was something that you wanted me to share, email me, and I'll be sure to get it done before the end of the day. And thank you very much, everybody, for being here.